Thank you very much. Essentially, when I had the beginnings of the idea for this book, I'd written a number of books before, particularly on Burma, and it was during COVID, and I started to get this kind of itch. You know, writers get an itch to do another book, you know, every so often. And I got this itch to do a book, and I started thinking of that China would be the obvious topic. But initially I thought, well, there are so many books on China. What can I possibly write that hasn't already been written? How can I add value? And then I started to think, well, although there are so many books on China, and there are excellent books on Chinese politics, Chinese history, the economy, there are great books on the Uyghurs and on Tibet and on Hong Kong, I couldn't think of a book, actually, that put all of those elements together in one volume. And so I sort of sketched out a half-baked, half-page email that I sent to Dean late one night. And I wasn't even pitching it to Dean. I was asking Dean, really, as a friend and as a publisher, what his professional advice was. You know, what do you think of this as an idea? And I sent the email off, and I went to sleep, and I woke up in the morning with a one-line reply from Dean, "I'll do it." I've never had a publisher reply to me like that before. And so he said, "I'll do it." And here we are. We've, over the last few years, we've been together in Ottawa, in Toronto, in Washington, D.C., in London. We've also launched the book in Brussels and other European cities, in Delhi. We went together to Dharamsala, and I'll come back to this later in the presentation, but to present the book to His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And the book, as you can see from this first image, is available not only in English but also in Chinese, published by a Taiwanese publisher, and in Polish in Poland. And I went to Warsaw a couple of years ago to launch it there. So if there are, well, there are obviously Chinese speakers in the room. If there are Polish speakers in the room, it's available in Polish as well. But tonight, what I want to share is about a little bit about the book, but in the context of this topic of the fight for the New World Order. Because I think, although the book was published now just over 3 years ago, and you might think, well, it's 3 years old, why am I giving a talk now? But I actually think that it is more relevant now than ever, because I think that we are in a fight for a new world order. We're in a fight between dictatorship and democracy. The parts of the free world, dialing the clock back by almost a decade. That's certainly how I feel in the United Kingdom. I feel that over the last few years until recently, we were beginning to make some progress on waking up to the challenges that the Chinese Communist Party poses. But in the last year or so, I feel that the clock has been turned back some time. We've seen just this last week the British Prime Minister Keir Starmer visiting China, and I can say more about that. We've seen, of course, in recent weeks, the Canadian Prime Minister, the French President, and other Western leaders doing the same. We've seen the British government approve what will be, if it does go ahead, the largest Chinese embassy in Europe in London. In the site of the old Royal Mint in London, right across the road from the Tower of London, on the site of highly sensitive cables that run between our two financial centres of the City of London and Canary Wharf. Many people have been warning of the risks of this building being used as a centre for espionage and for transnational repression, and yet the British government has gone ahead despite much opposition domestically, and approved it. We've seen, of course, the conviction of Jimmy Lai just before Christmas, and I'll say more about that as we go along. I was, to my surprise, named something like 95 times in the judgment in Jimmy Lai's trial. So I'm quite closely connected, not just as a friend of Jimmy Lai, but implicated in his judgment. And then, of course, we've seen all the recent geopolitical issues of Greenland and of what was discussed at Davos. So we are in a very interesting time, and I feel this book is is particularly timely right now. Just to say a few words about the book itself and why it's relevant. As I say, I tried to cover all of the major issues, particularly from a human rights perspective, and I'll go through those one by one in the presentation. I wove into the book quite a lot of personal narrative. It's not at all a personal memoir. It's very much about the issues and the people that are concerned. But I wanted to weave in some personal experiences, really to illustrate the fact that I'm not pontificating about China from an armchair in London. This is a country that I have spent more than 30 years in and around. And the reason I use those words in and around is that for much of the last 30 years I was in China, but for the last several years I cannot be in China, but I'm around it. And I did over 80 interviews for the book with people from the different communities, with Uyghurs. But I wanted to make the point that I have a personal connection with China. So just to give you that personal background, I first went to China when I was 18 years old in 1992 to teach English in Qingdao on the east coast of China. Qingdao is famous for the best beer in China. That wasn't the reason I went there, but it was a nice discovery once I was there. And in fact, I remember having a tour of the Qingdao brewery one day. And it was a day when I was teaching classes in the morning and classes in the afternoon. And I went for the tour of the brewery at lunchtime. And I have absolutely no recollection what I taught in the afternoon, but it was a great experience. On my way to Qingdao, I flew on Pakistani International Airways and changed flights in Karachi. And Pakistani Airways managed to lose my luggage in Karachi. So I arrived in Beijing with no luggage. And so I needed a change of clothes. And I bought a T-shirt that has the words, which I'm told from a quote from Chairman Mao, "You are not a real man if you have not climbed the Great Wall." Well, I not only climbed the Great Wall, but on one occasion I managed to sleep on the Great Wall under the stars. So hopefully my manhood is not in doubt. When I was first in China in 1992, it was of course 3 years after the Tiananmen massacre in 1989. And in the book I have a chapter that devotes a lot of attention to Tiananmen. I had the privilege of interviewing a number of people who were there firsthand, including indeed Bob Fu, but also the Canadian journalist Jan Wong, who was a first-hand witness to those horrific events. But despite that backdrop of being there just 3 years after Tiananmen, I had a really enjoyable time in Qingdao. And one of the reasons for including these personal elements of the story is to make the point, contrary to what the Chinese Communist Party will try to suggest, to make the point that I am not anti-China, I'm anti the CCP. Indeed, I love China. I made many friends there. I was teaching in 2 middle schools in Qingdao, including one of the most academic schools in the city. This is an image of a very young me teaching. And one of the things I did in the school was to propose doing a school play. And they'd never done a school play before. It had to go to both the head teacher but also the party secretary for approval. And the play I chose to produce with my students, and bearing in mind my students were almost the same age as me. I was 18 and I was teaching 16, 17-year-olds, so many of them became my friends. But the play I chose to do was my own adaptation of Alice in Wonderland. And I got hold of the novel in an English language bookstore in Qingdao, and I wrote the script from it. And we did auditions. And when I was casting the cast, I had a quite amusing experience, because those of you who know Alice in Wonderland will know that there's a part in the story where she shrinks, and there's a part in the story where she grows very tall. And so I had to cast an Alice who was sort of average height for the normal Alice. I had to find someone who was very short to play her when she shrinks. And it was possible to find people for those two roles. But then came the challenge of finding someone much taller than everybody else to play Alice when she grows. I struggled. I couldn't find any of my Chinese students who were significantly taller than others. And they all looked at me and they said, well, there is only one person who is much taller than everybody else. And I didn't include the pictures, and in fact I don't even know if I still have pictures, but I played Alice for those scenes where she grew tall. So that was my moment in theatre in China. And as I say, I made lots of friends, and I kept in touch with my friends in Qingdao for many years. The reason that I became later in life much more vocal on human rights issues in China is not because I'm anti-China, it's because I'm pro-China, it's because I love China and I want people like the friends I made there to enjoy the kind of freedoms that we take for granted in our own societies. After my time in Qingdao and my time at university, I then began my working life in Hong Kong. And I moved to Hong Kong in 1992, just a couple of months after the handover of Hong Kong. I lived there for 5 years from 1997 to 2002, working as a journalist. And the second chapter of the book describes my experiences living in those first 5 years after the handover. And I can honestly say that in those first 5 years, one country, two systems, the principle on which Hong Kong was handed over to China, was at that time, by and large, working reasonably well. Certainly, I was able to write articles for the newspaper I was working for that today, if I were to write them, if I was living in Hong Kong, they would never be published, and I would probably be arrested for writing them. I mean, just to give you one example, I wrote the editorials for a newspaper, but I also wrote a column in my own name. And I wrote a number of columns in my own name, very critical of the, at the time, the Secretary for Security in Hong Kong, Regina Ip. And Regina Ip, some of you may know of, is a fairly aggressive pro-CCP, pro-Beijing Hong Kong politician. And one day I had written this column that was pretty critical of her. And my editor came into the newsroom, and he had just met her at a drinks reception. But he came into the newsroom laughing, and he said to me, "Ben, Regina is very unhappy with you." And apparently she had approached him at this drinks reception and complained about me. But that was all that happened, and he laughed, and we all laughed, and we just brushed it off and said, well, that's Regina. These days, if such an incident had happened, it would have far, far graver consequences. So that just illustrates how much Hong Kong has changed. After those happy times in Qingdao and those early years in Hong Kong, I left Hong Kong and I was for many years working on other parts of Asia, particularly Burma and other areas. And I guess the turning point for me really came in 2014 when the umbrella movement in Hong Kong happened. I had continued to follow the situation in China, the human rights situation, and in Hong Kong. But the moment I really knew that I had to speak up and become much more active was the umbrella movement in 2014. Talking about how I turned from being having happy times in China as a student and then as a young journalist in Hong Kong to where I felt the time came to speak out much more actively. And that time was really when the umbrella movement in Hong Kong happened in 2014. And I saw these scenes from London of these courageous, many thousands of people in Hong Kong taking to the streets peacefully and in an amazingly orderly way, and then being brutally cracked down on by the Hong Kong police. And at that time, it's changed now, but at that time, I was struck by how few voices there were speaking out on it. And I thought, well, somebody needs to be speaking out. And I thought, because I had lived in Hong Kong, I had a responsibility to do so. And so I started initially writing articles and talking to members of parliament, just on my own with no organization behind me. And then after a few years, I realized it wasn't sustainable to do this on my own. I got more and more involved. I started campaigning for Hong Kong's first 3 political prisoners, Joshua Wong, Nathan Law, and Alex Chow. And I remember being on a beach just when I got news of their conviction. And I was supposedly on holiday, and I was walking along this beach, and I thought, well, somebody should do something for these 3. I knew all 3 personally. Somebody should do something. Somebody should organize a letter or a statement. And then it fairly quickly dawned on me that maybe that somebody was me. And so I went back to my room and I contacted virtually every politician and public figure that I could think of, not only in the UK and Europe and the United States, but also in Asia, and organized this statement calling for the release of Joshua and Alex and Nathan. And then I started to help organize and speak at protests in London with the symbolic yellow umbrella that, of course, had been the symbol of the umbrella movement. There then came a point where I thought, I can't do this on my own anymore. I need an organization. And I had this idea to start, to co-found Hong Kong Watch, which Ambassador Brownback is one of our patrons. But before launching Hong Kong Watch, I thought I ought to go back to Hong Kong on a visit to talk to people, to find out what they want us to do, to listen to them and get first-hand information. So in October 2017, I made what I thought would be a visit to Hong Kong. But I found myself on arrival in Hong Kong airport being denied entry. I believe I was one of the first Westerners to be denied entry. This was 3 years before the draconian national security law was imposed on Hong Kong. And it became, at the time, quite an incident. The British Foreign Secretary called in the Chinese. It was raised in both Houses of Parliament. I said to the members of Parliament who told me they were going to raise it, I said, it's great that you're going to raise it, but don't make it about me. Make it about Hong Kong and about what this says about what's happening to Hong Kong. And I guess from then on, it's been pretty clear that the Chinese Communist Party don't seem to like me very much. After being denied entry, I then started to receive a succession of, really dozens of threatening letters at my home address. The first one came actually with the words "watch him" on it and went to all of my neighbours in the street where I live in London, which was a new way of getting to know my neighbours. My mother, who lives in a totally different part of the country from me, also started to receive letters. And these letters basically said, "Dear Mrs. Rogers, tell your son to shut up." Thankfully, my mother, firstly, is very supportive of what I do, and secondly, has a great sense of humor. And she called me after receiving the first letter, and she said, "Ben, I just want to tell you, I gave up trying that many years ago." I then received, more seriously in 2022, an official letter from the Hong Kong police telling me that unless I shut down the work of Hong Kong Watch within, I think, 48 hours, I would receive a prison sentence in Hong Kong. So needless to say, I can no longer go back to Hong Kong, or rather, I probably could go back, but I might not come out again. And so I've chosen not to. The point in sharing, and these all generated a lot of attention. Congressman Smith raised some of these issues in Congress. The point of, and also it was, I became the subject of a protest on the floor of the Hong Kong legislature when I was denied entry, at a time when the pro-democracy camp was still in the legislature, and some very brave Hong Kong legislators spoke up there about the incident. And so we then launched Hong Kong Watch with a number of public figures, including the last governor of Hong Kong, Lord Patten. And the last example just of what I've experienced, and I share these stories of what I've experienced not because of what's happened to me, because they illustrate if the Chinese Communist Party is doing these things to me, a Westerner, a British citizen, you can imagine how much worse it is for the diaspora communities, for Hong Kongers, Uyghurs, Tibetans, Falun Gong practitioners, Chinese dissidents who have family back home and who are far more vulnerable than I am. But the final incident I experienced was in 2018 when at the Conservative Party conference in the UK, we had a panel of 3 generations of Hong Kong activists. The great Martin Lee, the father figure of the democracy movement in Hong Kong, Benny Tai, one of the organizers of the umbrella movement, and Nathan Law, the youngest elected legislator in Hong Kong. Martin Lee, sadly, has now withdrawn from public life because of the situation in Hong Kong. He would be arrested if he continued to speak out. Benny Tai is in prison, and Nathan Law is in exile. But we organized this event, and towards the end of the event, and it was actually chaired by our mutual friend Fiona Bruce, the former UK Special Envoy on Freedom of Religion or Belief. Towards the end, I noticed this Chinese lady called Kong Lin Lin looking pretty unhappy. And Fiona Bruce asked me to make some concluding remarks. We were just at the end of the event. Asked me to make some closing remarks before handing the final word to Martin Lee. And just as I was speaking, and I very deliberately said what I just said a few moments ago to you, that I'm not anti-China, that I love China and the people and its culture. It's the Chinese Communist Party that I oppose. She jumped up and started screaming at me in a way that I have never been screamed at before. And she said that I was a liar, that I was trying to destroy China, as if I had that power. And she went on and on, shouting at me. And after some time, Fiona Bruce very politely said, "Okay, madam, you've made your point. Could you now resume your seat?" And she didn't. And one of our volunteers then, very politely, very properly, he didn't do anything improper, approached her and said, "Madam, you've been asked to take your seat. Please would you do so?" And she hit him. And Martin Lee was whispering to me, saying, "Someone should get this on camera." And but there was nothing we could do because we were on the panel. But thankfully, somebody did get it on camera. Our volunteer very calmly, I don't know what I would have done in that situation, but he was remarkable. Having been already slapped once, he just very calmly said, "Madam, if you hit me again, we will have to call security." And she hit him again. So we did call security. And this was all caught on camera, and it went viral. I remember, again, our mutual friend Lord Alton, who wrote the foreword to the book, was in Pakistan at the time, and he messaged me saying, "I've just seen your incident on the BBC." But anyway, that's how the Chinese Communist Party, as many of you will know, behaves. So those were some of my experiences. But I carried on, and in 2019, I think the work of Hong Kong Watch was really shown to be so necessary, because 2019 was, of course, the turning point for Hong Kong. Another round of large-scale protests, police brutality, captured in these images here. In 2020, the imposition of the draconian national security law that totally shredded whatever was left of Hong Kong's freedom. I had the great privilege of coming to know Jimmy Lai and his family, and of course his newspaper, the Apple Daily, which I had the honor of writing for edition. Was shut down in 2021, and he, of course, was arrested and jailed in 2020, and has spent the last more than 5 years in solitary confinement, was convicted just before Christmas, and we're awaiting his final sentence. But it's highly likely that unless a major intervention by the United Kingdom, because he's a British citizen, but also the United States and other countries, unless a major intervention is made, it's highly likely that he will die in jail, working with people like Nathan Law and others. But I want to turn now to the broader situation, because the book and my work is not just about Hong Kong. Over the years, the crackdown on dissidents across China has intensified. There was a time, I remember in the 1990s and the early 2000s when I was in China, when, of course, China was not free. China's never been free under the Communist Party. But there was a time where there was a bit more space, where it was a little bit more relaxed, where there were bloggers and bookstores and human rights lawyers who were able, within a limited space, to very courageously to function. But what we've seen really since Xi Jinping came into power is a major crackdown on dissidents. Really, I guess, starting from about 2008, from the Beijing Olympics, the Charter 08 movement, the death of Liu Xiaobo, and many human rights defenders now in prison. And I want to pay tribute to Sophie and her courageous campaigning for her husband and for other brave dissidents in China. And I have a whole chapter on their plight. And then, of course, there's the genocide of the Uyghurs, which again I have a chapter on. A genocide that was recognized in the final days of the first Trump administration, and that recognition was accepted by the Biden administration. A genocide that also was recognized by an independent tribunal that took place in London, which I played a small part in helping to initiate. A British barrister called Sir Geoffrey Nice, who had been the chief prosecutor of Slobodan Milosevic. And I had worked with Sir Geoffrey on a number of other issues. And I remember actually with Bob introducing Sir Geoffrey to a number of Uyghurs in London and saying, would you look at the Uyghur situation? And he said, why don't we do an independent tribunal? And that tribunal came to the conclusion that what is happening to the Uyghurs is a genocide. And then there's the situation in Tibet. Writing the Tibet chapter of the book was in many ways the most educational part of researching the book, because it's fair to say that up to that point, Tibet was the one aspect of the CCP's human rights violations that, of course, I was acutely aware of, but I was much less involved with compared to the other issues. But I became much more involved with it as a result of writing the book. I interviewed a number of Tibetans. I interviewed His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And I just want to read an extract that I think captures the essence of both the situation in Tibet, but also the aspirations of the Tibetan people. Today's Tibet, Wongden Kiab, who was someone I interviewed, said, is a prison in which your movements are monitored, your thoughts corrected, and your rights confiscated, snatched, and crushed. However, like almost all the Tibetans I spoke to, he holds on to hope. They cannot kill all the Tibetans, he said. So as long as there is a single Tibetan on this earth, their spirit will remain for generations. One day we can have our own country. Nima Lemo expressed a similar belief. Our hope is driven by the fact that the truth always prevails. Truth is on our side, she told me. That is why Tibetans are hopeful, because truth always wins. For her and for most Tibetans, their two desires are to meet the Dalai Lama and to see Tibet free. We want to live our own lives, to live in freedom, to live with our heads held high, she said. Lobsang Tsetem, a young Tibetan who was translating for Nima Lamo in our interview, added an additional aspiration. Born and raised in exile, he said he had no bigger desire than to be a citizen of a free Tibet, to walk on the streets of Tibet, and as a football fan, I should translate that to soccer fan, I guess, here, to watch the Tibetan national football team play in the World Cup. Admitting that this was perhaps a far-fetched dream, nevertheless, he said, I want to sit in a stadium and cheer the Tibetan football team. For us, freedom comes in these small forms. I also want to take part in a nation-building process to elect Tibetan leaders in Tibet. Those are the simple aspirations of the Tibetan people, and certainly I intend to stand with them in pursuit of those goals. Dean, who introduced me earlier on, I sometimes say about Dean, and I don't think he minds me saying this, Dean is someone who's a wonderful friend, who is someone with crazy ideas, but two types of crazy idea. When we launched the book in London, it happened to be the very day that Rishi Sunak took office as the British Prime Minister. And I remember Dean ringing me that morning. Rishi Sunak was moving into 10 Downing Street, and Dean said, why don't we go down to 10 Downing Street and get a copy of the book into the hands of your new Prime Minister? And I said, Dean, I'd love to, but we won't get anywhere near him. There's no way, it's just impossible. But separately, Dean said to me, why don't we go to Dharamsala and give a book to the Dalai Lama? And I said, well, actually, that's a lot more achievable than getting it to my own Prime Minister. And we did. And we went out to Dharamsala, and we had a wonderful audience with His Holiness. When we gave him the book, the first thing he saw was the Tibetan flag on the cover, and he pointed at it and smiled. Another issue that the book covers and that I work on is the crackdown on Christians across China. It's intensified particularly in recent months, and Bob has been doing courageous work on this, but it's been going on for a long time. Some years ago I wrote this article, which was the cover story, called China's War on Christianity, and threats to religious freedom are emerging in Hong Kong as well. I authored a couple of years ago a report by Hong Kong Watch on the issue of religious freedom in Hong Kong. I titled that report, Sell Out My Soul. It's a play on words of an old English hymn, Tell Out My Soul. But it captures what people in Hong Kong are increasingly being forced to do, to compromise and to censor themselves and to sell out their soul. I also have a chapter on the persecution of Falun Gong and the horrific issue of forced organ harvesting. And again, Sir Geoffrey Nice chaired an independent tribunal on this issue and concluded that forced organ harvesting is happening in a widespread and systematic way, and that it amounts to a crime against humanity. And I think it's very interesting. Sometimes we might look at these issues and think, this is too huge. What can I possibly do? I'm one person. What happened with Sir Geoffrey Nice was I went to him, having been involved with the issue of forced organ harvesting for some time. And I said to Sir Geoffrey Nice, would he be willing to look at the evidence? Because of all the human rights issues, forced organ harvesting, I think, is one of the most shocking, but it's also one of the most difficult to prove, because by definition, the victims are no longer with us. The witnesses are the doctors who've carried out the operations, and the evidence is swept away. Nevertheless, there is some evidence. And I asked Sir Geoffrey if he would be willing to look at it and provide a legal opinion. And he looked at me and he said, why don't we do something bigger than that? Why don't we hold an independent tribunal? And the conclusion of the China Tribunal's judgment was damning. It includes the statement that this is happening, that it's crimes against humanity, and that anyone engaging with the Chinese state that is carrying out these crimes should do so in the knowledge that they are engaging with a criminal state. Drawing towards a close, Taiwan, of course, is the other big issue. And I have a chapter on Taiwan in the book. I've campaigned over the years for a number of Taiwanese who have been arrested and jailed in China, and thankfully have been released, and I've had the privilege of meeting them in Taiwan. I had the privilege of presenting the book to the Foreign Minister of Taiwan last November. If we believe in freedom and democracy and human rights, we, as well as focusing on the human rights violations in China, we need to be stepping up our support for Taiwan as a beacon of those values in Asia. In the book, I have two other chapters looking at the Chinese Communist Party's relationship with and facilitation of atrocity crimes in two other dictatorships, its neighbors in Burma and in North Korea. And the atrocities that are committed in Burma, the airstrikes that the military regime is carrying out every day against its citizens, the genocide of the Rohingya people, the recent sham election that the military regime has just conducted in an exercise to try to gain legitimacy for itself, but in reality a total sham. They banned 40 political parties, all their political opponents are in jail, much of the population was disenfranchised. I've often said that it was not a general election, it was an election of generals. But it was also facilitated, and all their crimes are facilitated by China. It's China that's providing them with the arms, with the finance, and with the political and diplomatic support, enabling them to carry out atrocities like this that I've witnessed time after time in the conflict zones of Burma and in the jungles. And then, of course, North Korea. China has this, as well as supporting the regime in Pyongyang, it has this terrible policy of forced repatriation of North Korean refugees, and should be held to account for that. As I conclude now, what do we do? Well, the final chapter in the book is an attempt to answer that question. And in this fight for a new world order, this fight for democracy against autocracy, we should firstly redouble our efforts to stand up and defend our values of freedom and human rights and the rule of law. We should at the same time redouble our efforts to defend and strengthen our security, to act against Chinese spies, of whom we have quite a number in the British Parliament, as recent months have shown, and I think in the Canadian Parliament and elsewhere. We should be strengthening our security. We should be diversifying our supply chains and reducing our dependency on China. And most of all, we should be standing up and not kowtowing. We need to have an answer to this question, which was hanging in a bamboo hut in Burma some years ago. Are you for democracy or dictatorship? And if we're for democracy, then we need to stand up for it. And I just close with these words from the end of the book that I hope provide a challenge, but also the beginnings of an answer to that question, what do we do? As Wu Kai-shi, a name many of you will know, one of the leaders of the Tiananmen protests, as Wu Kai-shi told me, Congressman Chris Smith said on the 30th anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre that, quote, in between the tank and the tank man, you have to choose a side. There is no middle way. There is no in-between. Today, with more than 1 million Uyghurs in concentration camps, a pandemic that hit the whole world, the dismantling of Hong Kong's freedoms, threats to Taiwan increasing, we need to end what the foreign policy establishment calls strategic ambiguity and introduce strategic clarity. That clarity is the answer to the question of what the free world should do. Stand clear and tell Beijing that there is a red line. The goal, as dissident Xu Zhiyong puts it in his powerful book, to build a free China, is a free China with democracy and the rule of law, a just and prosperous civil society, and a new national spirit of freedom, justice, and love. If we can help the peoples of China and Hong Kong, Tibet, and East Turkestan achieve that, then the world will be a better, more peaceful, and safer place. And my final slide captures what the book is all about. This is the book that Xi Jinping doesn't want you to read, and I think that's quite a good reason to buy it and read it. Thank you very much for having me tonight. Thank you. I'd be delighted.
Besides human rights, what other perspective are you referring to regarding the fight between democracy and dictatorship? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I think besides the human rights situation in China itself, and indeed the human rights situations in other countries where the Chinese regime is facilitating human rights violations, there is also the issue of the threat to our own freedoms here at home in the United States, in the United Kingdom, in other established democracies. Some people will say the Chinese Communist Party is not an expansionist regime, that it's not an aggressive regime, that it's not fighting a war. We've been at war for some time, not a military war, but a war in terms of their influence, their infiltration, their campaigns of intimidation and efforts to coerce and co-opt and undermine our freedoms. And so it isn't just about the human rights issues in China itself, it's about our own freedoms here. And one of the things that really disturbs me in the UK is increasingly there are, for example, Hong Kongers who have left Hong Kong and come to the United Kingdom. They had to flee the repression there, and they thought they were coming to find freedom in the UK. But instead, the CCP has followed them there, and they're facing bounties and arrest warrants and campaigns of harassment far greater than the harassment that I've experienced. And that's a threat to them first and foremost, but it's also a threat to our own freedoms and security at home.
In your experience, what has been the most effective method to help the Chinese government begin to adhere to human rights in whatever limited fashion?
There was a period of time in the 1990s and 2000s under different pre-Xi Jinping's leadership where I know there were initiatives by the UK and other governments to have dialogues with the Chinese government on, for example, the rule of law, helping train judges and lawyers. There might have been, if the Chinese government at that time had remained of the sort of slightly more, it's probably too much to say open-minded, but perhaps the slightly less close-minded mentality than Xi Jinping has. Maybe in the long term that could have sown some seeds of change. With the Xi Jinping regime, it's very hard to see how any kind of meaningful engagement of that kind can help. That doesn't mean we shouldn't engage. I always say about engagement, it's not a question of whether to engage, it's about how and on whose terms and with what objectives. But I think at the moment what we really need is sustained pressure, increased pressure, because I think the Chinese Communist Party ultimately only responds to strength, and they only respect strength. I'll never forget when Xi Jinping came to London on a state visit in, I think it was 2015. He and David Cameron hosted him, and they took him for a pint in the pub, and all of these things, and rolled out the red carpet. And the British government didn't say anything about human rights. And we managed to get one member of Parliament, Fiona Bruce, to raise an urgent question in Parliament about human rights in China while Xi Jinping was still in the country. And the British government were furious because they said, you're derailing our efforts to build a relationship with China, because it was the only moment where Parliament publicly addressed the human rights situation during his visit. But I remember hearing an American businessman who had been doing business in Shanghai for many years, and he was interviewed on the radio in the UK. And he said these words which have stayed with me ever since. He said, if you act like a panting puppy, China will think that they have you on a leash, whereas if you actually stand up for your values and confront them, they won't like it, but they will respect you more for having the strength to defend your values and your security. So I think that's what we need to do at this stage, is to stand up much more and to put pressure on them. And then if they begin to change their ways, then we can have more meaningful engagement in terms of assisting them practically to change. But you can't do that whilst they're refusing to change.
Okay, thank you all for coming tonight. Have a good night, and we hope to see you again at our future event.
Thank you.